Katrina, and today I'm filming a little unhaul. I've had to take quite a few books off my shelves because I am moving soon, and I'm trying to reduce the number of books I'm bringing with me on the move. Also, I'm going to be dropping off all of these books at little libraries in my neighborhood. I haven't done a great job with replenishing little libraries. I don't always have a book with me, and I've done a couple of drop-offs of like 5-10 books here and there, but this is going to be my big final send-off for all my little libraries that have treated me so well while I lived in DC. I'm just gonna meander around the neighborhood and put some books in all of them as much as I can find. So at first I had to pick out the books I was gonna get rid of, which was slightly tough, I'll say. There are some books on here that make me a little sad to get rid of, but at the end of the day, I sort of chose books to unhaul based on, am I going to reread them? And do I need this cover on my shelf? But I also did take off any book on my bookshelves that I rated lower than 4 stars, so 3 or 2 or 1 star, some of them, in order to only keep books on my shelf that I genuinely loved and enjoyed. And then there are also some books on here that I have not read, and I'm choosing to get rid of for reasons of I have a lot of other books to read before I ever get to them, so I don't need to keep them for now. And that was also a tough choice to make. I really wanted to make one of these unhaul videos, even though it's kind of early in this channel already to be unhauling books, because I am kind of sad about giving up some of these books. So memorializing them and having a record of which books I got rid of and when and why I got rid of them, I think will be nice in the future so that I'll remember these books. I could have also just taken a picture of them, but now I have a YouTube channel, so I thought I'd make a little video out of it. Don't mind me, I'm just drinking my vitamin C drink. The first group of books is a stack that I've had for a while. These are all books that I picked up both in high school and college when I was studying government. And a lot of these I've only read like chapters of, specifically chapters for classes that I needed. Some of these books are also books I bought my first semester of college before anyone told me that you don't have to buy every single book on the syllabus because the teachers will upload the chapters you need to read. I didn't know that at the time, so I bought them all, and now it's time to get rid of the ones that didn't impact me enough to keep. I'm keeping still some of them. I can see I'm keeping one of my copies of Nietzsche's writings as a memorial of the Nietzsche seminar I took. Don't ask. And I'm keeping like The Second Sex because I think it's fun to have on my shelf, and I annotated that so hard, so it's fun to have all those annotations and keep them. But otherwise, I'm getting rid of all of these. I'm putting them in little libraries. And I actually think this is such a good choice to put in DC little libraries. I live in the Capitol Hill area of DC, so I know that there are people that will love these and that they'll genuinely read them, which is all you can hope for old school books. Starting off, I have 5 Chiefs by John Paul Stevens. Realistically, I might actually read this at some point, but I've had it on my shelf now for about 5 or 6 years and I've never gotten around to it, and it's definitely from an era in my life where I was obsessed with the Supreme Court in high school, before I kind of separated politics from my own enjoyment of the world. So people here will really enjoy this. It's about the 5 chief justices that John Paul Stevens worked under or worked with. It's a fun summary of a huge time span of the Supreme Court history, but I'm just not the person I was when I originally bought this book. And then I have Abigail Adams, An American Heroine. Yeah, I got this from my high school government teacher. I've never read it. Maybe someone will. Then I have The Hollow Hope by Gerald Rosenberg. This is a book about whether or not the Supreme Court can bring about social change. I read a couple of chapters of it for my competition civics group that I was in high school, and I also tried to read some of it when I was in my freshman year of college. I'm never going to read this whole thing, and it's a huge book, and I don't need to keep it, but it does have some interesting points, so hopefully someone else can enjoy it. And then I have 2 books for my freshman year comparative politics seminar, Fighting Poverty in US and Europe, and Making Democracy Work, Civic Traditions in Modern Italy. These are both books I bought used from the campus bookstore and have never read more than what I needed to do for the readings in the class, so enough said. And then I have On the Genealogy of Morality by Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm not really into Nietzsche. It was an interesting seminar, but I'm never going to reread many of his writings, so I'm just getting rid of all of copies of his works other than just one that I annotated. So, and then lastly in this group is I Dissent, Great Opposing Opinions in Landmark Supreme Court Cases. Just a collection of like dissenting opinions. I think I read a couple of them in high school for my classes, but not really light reading, not something I really need to keep on my shelf. The next group of books are books I haven't read, so I'll also be able to go through these fairly quickly, but I'll give a little detail because of why I picked them up and then why, obviously, I'm now getting rid of them. This first collection, these are actually books I've picked up from little libraries over time, either just like swapping things out, or I thought they were interesting at a certain point, but I haven't read them yet, so any book from a little library that I've borrowed over the course of living here that I haven't read yet is going back out there. I'm not going to hold on to them if I haven't read them yet, because that was on me. I should have read them. But I did think most of these books were kind of cool, so I'm still going to keep them in my want to read, and maybe at some point I'll be able to pick up another copy and read them in the future, but for now, it's best they go back where they came from. The first book I have is 7 Days in the Art World by Sarah Thornton. This book seemed really cool. I actually picked this up right after finishing reading The Art Thief, which is like a fictionalized telling of the story of two most very successful art thieves in the 90s, 2000s. So afterwards I thought, oh, all this information about the art world is so cool. I saw this book in a little library and I thought it sounded so cool. And it does still sound cool, and I am still interested in the art world, but I'm just not gonna read this before I move, so enough said. The next book is Nights at the Circus by Angela Carter. I picked this up because I've heard Angela Carter really highly recommended by a lot of people, so I've been wanting to read something from her. And this book sounds so cool. It's about a woman who is part woman, part swan, which I thought sounded so interesting. And I know that Angela Carter has kind of like a kind of weird writing style, and I love weird writing styles. Unfortunately, I just never found time to pick it up. The mood was never quite right. And this particular copy I don't really need to keep because it is kind of messed up. But I do still plan to pick up Angela Carter at some point. And then the next book is The Last White Man by Mohsin Hamid. This was a really interesting sounding book that I picked up, and the cover is so cool. I thought this looked beautiful when I saw it in a little library. And I believe it's about a man who wakes up and has changed races. And so it's kind of a thought experiment on that concept and what could happen, and it was really short, but I do want to read this at some point. I'm going to say that for all of these books that I haven't read yet, but I just haven't had time to yet. Then we have South of the Border, West of the Sun by Haruki Murakami. Murakami is a really well-known writer, both in the online sphere and in general. He's really well-known, well-respected, and I do intend to read some of his writing at some point. I got really excited about reading him, and I picked up this book. And then I kind of got turned off from reading him because I've heard a lot of his criticism about how he writes women. I still want to try him because I know he works for some people and he doesn't for others, as all writers, but I don't think I'm in the right headspace yet. And I'll probably start with something else. I've heard that this isn't the book to start with, so I'll probably start with another one of his works. And then I have Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. I'm a big lover of all things Bronte and all things Austen and that era of classics. So Agnes Grey I picked up because I do want to read it at some point, but I needed to calm down. I did not need to pick this up. There are Bronte works and Austen works that I want to read before I ever get to this, so I was jumping the gun a little bit, but at some point I will get around to this. And then the last two are YA. The first one is If I Stay by Gail Forman. This is a classic. I read this in middle school, high school, somewhere around that age range, and devastated me. Loved it. Loved the sequel too when I read that. So when I saw this in the little library, I decided to pick it up for just a reread. I've done a little bit of rereading of it, but it hasn't hit necessarily the same as it did when I was 15. So I don't need to hold on to it. Is basically what I'm saying for this book. And then the next one is Perfect on Paper by Sophie Gonzalez. This seemed like a really cute YA romance between a girl who runs a matchmaking service and someone that she's trying to matchmake with. But I just never got around to it, and I actually started reading this one, and the writing style wasn't really what I was looking for at the time, so I put it down, and I probably won't pick it up again. Maybe at some point, because it seems like a cute concept, but not now. And then next, I have a little stack of books that I've bought, but I've never read for various reasons. The first one is The Sorcerer's Son by Phyllis Einstein. I picked this up at a library sale, and I do still think the concept sounds really cool, and it's kind of that old school fantasy vibe that I really like. I think I picked this up probably right after finishing The Book of Three, which is a children's fantasy series, like an old school children's fantasy series that I read last year that I really enjoyed, and I wanted to keep that kind of energy going. But I don't need this, is what I'm saying. I haven't got around to it yet, so I'm gonna give it to a little library so someone else can try it. And at some point I might read it on my Kindle instead. This is not a book that I need a physical copy of, is what I'm saying, so I think it's okay to say goodbye. And then I have Zafloya by Charlotte Dacre. You can see I had tabbed a couple because I started this book. This I bought off of Thrift Books, and I kind of wasn't expecting that this edition would look like this. It isn't a very well-known book, which I guess makes sense why. It doesn't have a ton of versions, but the font type is absolutely tiny. It's absolutely ridiculously small. So I think if I ever did read this book, I'd probably pick up a different version of it. But this is a gothic in the vein of The Monk, if you've heard of that book, but with a woman main character instead of a monk main character. And it's sort of following a similar idea of like corruption of dignity, and it's very dark and gothic. I read the introduction text about this one, and it doesn't really seem exactly like what I thought it was going to be, but I might still read it at some point. We'll see. And then next I have The Price of Salt by Patricia Highsmith. This is apparently like a really popular lesbian pulp novel from the 1900s that I've seen highly like recommended, or it is like fundamental text, and I do want to read more queer fundamental texts. But this edition is horrendous. I also bought this on Thrift Books, and it looks like someone like printed it at home. You can kind of see like they just printed out a picture of the cover on the cover, and the font type is also so ugly on the inside, so I'm getting rid of this. And at some point I might still read this book, but not this version. And then lastly, I have The Mists of Avalon by Marianne Bradley. This is a beautiful, beautiful book that I bought at a used bookstore. And I do still kind of want to read these books at some point. It's King Arthur's, it's like the story of King Arthur, basically just told from the perspective of like the women of Camelot, which sounds like such a great idea, such a great concept, but this is massive, and I have not had time to get to this, and I don't need to carry this around with me, is what I'm feeling in my heart of hearts, that I don't need to bring this with me. So this is a hard choice, but I haven't read it yet, and I have a lot of other books on that are up on my list before this, so unfortunately I will be saying goodbye to The Mists of Avalon. Why are they always doing gardening outside? You can hear them gardening outside. I apologize. I'm sorry. The rest of the books are all books that I've read, so I can give a little bit more information about them than I have on the ones I've been going through so far. The first stack I sorted apart are books that I read for my Afrofuturism sci-fi course in college. I loved that class, and I loved a lot of the books we read in the class. I still have like 6 more books from that class on my shelf that I love. It introduced me to some of my favorite authors ever, like Jennifer Marie Brissett and River Solomon, but some of them didn't work for me, or some of the additions here are also not like the cutest, so I feel like I can get rid of them knowing I've read them and that they were interesting and I learned a lot, but that I'm never going to reread them, so I don't need to hold on to them. The first one is After the Flare by Deji Olukoton. This was a really interesting book to read in the class and like analyze, but I remember a lot of people were confused because the professor liked to do this thing where he didn't like to reread books, and he's taught the course every year. So he would assign us sequels to books that he's already read, but we hadn't read. Which was slightly annoying, but whatever. This is the sequel to Nigerians in Space. And without reading that, it didn't make a ton of sense to me, so I didn't get a ton out of it. Maybe I'll go back at some point and read Nigerians in Space in order to understand what's going on in this novel, but otherwise, yeah, it was not a great experience reading this. It's about the aftermath of a solar flare where the only surviving functioning space program is in Nigeria. So they're running things from there, and they're trying to save an astronaut that's been stranded in the space station. So there's a lot of things going on, but I do think it follows pretty directly after Nigerians in Space, and the concept seems cool. I just didn't make a ton of sense to me when I read it. The next book is The Prey of Gods by Nikki Drayden. I really enjoyed how weird this book was. I think I was one of the only ones in the class that actually enjoyed this one because I am a lover of weird books. In the end, I'm okay with getting rid of this because the cover is not my favorite. It's kind of a weird cover. And I didn't annotate this specific copy or anything. I left a couple of corners tagged. But this book is about a futuristic South Africa where AIs and androids are a huge part of human life. And it actually has the perspective of an AI in this book that I thought was really well written and really kind of creepy and weird and cool. But otherwise, if I'm remembering correctly, because it's been a few years, there are a lot of different perspectives battling out in this book, and it was kind of confusing. So I think I remember, how many, did I give this a star rating? I'm trying to think about it in star rating terms. I think I probably gave this like a 3 stars or something like that, because there were parts that were cool, especially in the context of a class, but not enough to keep it. And then my last 2 books are by Nnedi Okorafor. The first one is Who Fears Death, and the second one is the complete trilogy of Binti, which I actually read this past year. It's a follow-up. I just don't think Nnedi Okorafor's writing style necessarily works for me. They have these really, really cool concepts that always suck me in, and I get really super intrigued. I feel like their books don't necessarily always land with me, though. If I remember correctly, this book deals with FGM and the child of a woman who is sexually assaulted. And it's a really, really intense topic. And I remember it like really sitting with me and being such like an emotional read, and it was so impactful. But the ending didn't really resolve anything. And I just remember the writing style not agreeing with me as much as the plot did. And the same sort of problem happened with Binti, where the first Binti, I will say, it's a trilogy of like novellas. And I will say the first Binti was incredible. I loved the first Binti. I thought that was such a good story on its own. But the second and third books kind of didn't stick the landing, and I didn't really enjoy where it went. And it kind of went off the rails with people coming back to life, and then people dying, and then people coming back to life. And it kind of undid everything that was talked about in the first Binti, which was about this like permanence of life and death, I felt like. So as much as I've loved the concept in these books, I probably won't be picking up any more of Nnedi Okorafor's writing just because it didn't work for me. And then randomly, I also have a volume of manga that I'm getting rid of, Hunter x Hunter, the first volume. I heard people say that this is a good manga to get into, and I was trying to get into manga at the time. I don't know why. I've since decided that it's actually a good thing I'm not into manga because I can't really afford the space of having that many issues on my shelf. I might still try reading this at some point. I remember I got like halfway. It just wasn't working for me necessarily for what I wanted at the time. And I thought the first issue was interesting, but yeah, I don't need a physical copy of this. If I ever did read these, maybe I would read it instead on like a tablet or something like that. I'm still looking for that perfect volume of manga that's going to get me into manga. But it was not Hunter x Hunter, unfortunately. And then I have this copy of The Ruins of Gorlan by John Flanagan. Now, I love the Ranger's Apprentice series. This was my shit as a child. I love this series. I have another copy. I found another copy of the original cover, which brings back all the memories of my childhood of reading this series. So I don't need this copy. I don't need this like newer cover version. I don't need 2 copies of this series. So this is a series that, would you believe it, is about a ranger's apprentice. And it's set in kind of like a medieval-ish, magical-ish setting. They are middle grade books. I just remember loving these so much in elementary school. The main character, Will, goes through like different trials throughout the books. And I think there's a bunch of spin-off series as well that I've been meaning to maybe read at some point when I'm looking for nostalgia. Then I'll probably get back to this, but don't need this copy. Let me put these over here so I can grab them more easily. Ugh. And then I have The City of Dusk by Tara Sim. Now, I actually enjoyed this book, and I'm probably going to read the sequel, but I didn't really enjoy it enough to have a copy of it on my shelf. And I keep putting off picking up the sequel. I always forget. I think it's called The Midnight Kingdom. Yeah, I think it might be called something like that. And it's in like white, and they're beautiful copies. especially next to each other, these like thick, beautiful paperbacks. But I made the executive decision that I'm not going to keep this copy because it's very large, and I think I gave the book 3 stars, so I said I wouldn't keep any 3 stars. So I am unfortunately getting rid of this copy. I do still think I recommend this book because I did think it was an interesting concept. It's about a city split into 4 like categories of necromancy magic. We get a perspective from each of like the heirs of their respective categories, and we learn about their individual magics, and they're all going through it in various ways, and they all have their individual storylines that interconnect. And I love that concept. So like I said, I think I will read the sequel. But if I'm remembering correctly, the writing style wasn't my favorite, and I didn't necessarily love the characters. They didn't really work for me, and the characters working for me is very important, in my opinion. So I will be giving this to a little library for someone to grab. And then I have 2 Book of the Month books. I was trying to cut down my Book of the Month collection. Most of them I've enjoyed to a reasonable degree, but I don't really like hardcovers, which is kind of the whole point of Book of the Month. And they all are kind of imposing on my bookshelf up there. I don't think they're making it into this shot, but I decided to cut down my collection a little bit. I've taken out Heartless Hunter, which is the first book in a series about a witch fighting who falls in love with like a witch hunter. I believe this is romantasy. I really enjoyed this for the most part. There was a lot of tropes in it, but it was a good time. I remember reading it like a day or 2. I don't need a hard copy of it. It just feels so unnecessary. And I'm probably going to read the sequel on Kindle Unlimited or Kindle or something like that. So I was kind of shocked that it made it as a Book of the Month pick, because I thought Book of the Month is supposed to pick like the best books of the month. I was like, this is good, but this was the best book that came out in February. I don't think it was. But it was a good time. So I still recommend it. I just don't need a hardcover version of it. And then I have Immortal Longings by Chloe Gong. Again, I enjoyed this. I told myself I was going to pick up the sequel too, but it's out now, and I still haven't felt the urge to. Maybe if I'm ever in like a YA arc again. This is a relatively interesting book. It's like a retelling of Antony and Cleopatra, which I think is a Shakespearean play. Yeah. Which I think is such a great idea, and it's so cool. And it's kind of written in like a Hunger Games esque setting, dystopia world, where there is a contest where you're fighting to the death, and then the winner gets a ton of money. And they're in like a very crammed city. So lots of YA tropes in here, lots of dystopian tropes. I don't think it was bad. I just feel like I've read better. And you can see I even tried tabbing it, and I have 2 tabs in here. So there weren't like a ton of amazingly well-written things that really impacted me. So I think I'm okay with saying goodbye to this edition as well, Immortal Longings. And then the last 3 books are all books that I very recently read, and some of them I've enjoyed, but I've decided to give them away because I originally got them from little libraries. So I felt like with these copies, I want to read them and return them like you would with an actual library, so that someone else could enjoy them, because they're beautiful editions. So the first one is An Education in Malice by S.T. Gibson. Didn't love this. It was a fun concept. I read it in my autumnal reading vlog for the vampire vibes, which I thought were great, but unfortunately was being held up to the standard of other books that I read in that vlog that I loved, so it just couldn't hold up. And I don't really need a physical copy of this. I just picked it up because I saw it in a little library one day and I knew I wanted to read it. So I'm happy to return it from whence it came, and continue the cycle of it being read. And then I have The Kite Runner and A Thousand Splendid Suns. This is a case of, I gave both of these books 5 stars. I loved it. You can see I tabbed them absolutely to death. They really, really impacted me, and it was really emotional, and I really loved these books. So it was kind of a tough choice. But at the end of the day, I felt really lucky to find these at a little library, and I think these are books that everyone should read. So this was kind of a choice where I decided I don't mind having buying my own copies in the future if I did want to reread them. So for now, I'm going to pass them on. I'm going to leave all my tabs in them too. I don't know if that's bad practice. If you can tell me in the comments if it's bad practice to leave tabs when giving books to little libraries. But I think it's kind of fun. Like, I would love to see what other people tabbed in books. And they're all transparent tabs that you can still read the page through. And people can just take them out. So I just think it's fun to leave them in for people to see. But let me know if you think otherwise. But yeah, hopefully other people can pick these up and love them as much as I love them, because They were both beautifully written, and I couldn't believe I took so long to read them. They deal really well with the complexity of the history of Afghanistan leading up to the early 2000s when he wrote both of these. And I think especially when they came out in that time period when the US was waging war in the Middle East, that having the courage to tell this story at the time, he was like one of the very first to use storytelling to share different narratives about the Middle East. I don't need to ramble about what these books are about. People know that they're great. You should know they're great. I know they're great. And I'm sad to see them go, but I'm also happy to send them out to someone else. But yeah, those are all the books I'm unhauling. It made me a little sadder to see them all. I was like in a more ruthless mood when I picked them out. And now I'm like, well, this is part of my collection. It sucks to say goodbye to part of my collection. But I just have to think about it as cleaning up my collection and narrowing it down just to books that I really, really loved and really made an impact on me. And that'll be nice as well, to look at my bookshelves and only see books that I have read and loved. And I really did need to cut down my physical TBR some of books I haven't read that I have physical copies of. I have a special shelf for that. And it had gotten out of hand, not gonna lie. So I'm happy to pick these out and send them forward. Yeah, if you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a comment below. I love to talk to people who have watched these videos. But remember to treat your little libraries with respect and return books to them if you take books out, because that's how the world keeps spinning. I'm not always the best at it because a lot of times I'm not carrying a book when I run across a little library, but I always try to go back and return, in this case, even more books than what I've taken out. I had such a fun time filming this and revisiting some of these books. And I hope the people who get them next love them as much as I did, or love them potentially much more than I did. Thank you so much for watching again, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!